If you've ever wondered why sometimes your photos come out too bright or too dark, then you may want to consider your metering mode. Now in most cameras there are 3 main types of metering modes, and I'll go over each one of these in this video. However, I also want to show you that ultimately there's really only one mode that really matters. But first off, what do the metering modes actually do? Well, inside your camera there is a light sensor, and you can see this in your camera on this graph, which is called a histogram. Let me quickly show you what it does. This right here is a histogram. It's a visual representation of what your camera is seeing in front of you. It's broken into a couple of different parts. On the left side of the histogram is all the dark and shadowy areas. On the right side of the histogram are all the lighter areas, all of our highlights. And you can see as I adjust the exposure up and down, this histogram will naturally shift either to the right if we're raising our exposure, or to the left as we drop our exposure down. What's important here is it tells us when we are clipping or losing any of our information. When you see a big spike on the left side of the graph or a big spike on the right side of the graph, it generally means that you've lost some information here, meaning that ultimately, if you're trying to edit it in post, you're probably not going to recover any of that detail. And obviously, when we're taking photographs, we want to lose as little information as possible, ideally none, that we might want to use when we get back into our editing studio. And there are a couple of tools that I'm going to show you a little bit later in the video that will allow you to come away from taking photos with as much detail as possible. So what are the 3 different types of metering modes, and ultimately, what do they do? Look at that. Wow. TV magic board. Ta-da! There we go. So 3 different types of metering mode: matrix, center, and spot. Now, each one of these different metering modes is going to be looking at a different amount of our frame. These are our 3 beautiful frames right here. Photos of white pages of nothingness. So matrix mode, this is going to be looking at the entirety of our frame. Center, as you might have guessed, is just going to be looking roughly at the center of our frame, and spot is going to be looking at an even smaller area of our frame. And this is where our camera is going to be looking when it's creating one of these histograms. I made this entire whiteboard just for this, and we're never going to use it again. Why does this matter? Well, because if we're using a semi-automatic mode, as I like to call them, so something like aperture priority or shutter priority, or my favorite, which is manual plus auto ISO, our camera is going to react in a very different way in each of these settings. Ultimately, in their standard settings, these semi-automatic modes are going to be trying to create quite a balanced exposure. So if what it thinks in front of it is very, very dark, it's going to raise our exposure. Or if it thinks what's in front of it is very, very bright, it's going to try and lower the overall exposure. We're going to start by talking about spot metering, but much of what I'm going to talk about is applicable to center metering as well. Now, one reason why people would want to use spot metering is when you have a highlight or some bright area, for example, like a white bit of plumage on this mandarin duck you can see here, in a very, very dark environment. And the goal here is to try and expose the highlight in order to not lose any detail. But I want to show you now why this is not always a great idea. So let's start off by showing the best case example. So what I've done here is I've simulated what spot metering will do. I've cropped down just to look at the center of the chest into the plumage. And as you can see, what our histogram is now looking at is it thinks that what is in front of it is a very, very bright area. As you can see here, all of our data is all on the right side of the graph, so into our bright area. So in these semi-automatic modes, what our camera will be doing now is reducing the overall exposure to save the detail in these highlights. So we're going to simulate this by reducing down our overall exposure into what our camera would probably try and do, which is somewhere in the middle, something like this. And as you can see here, what our camera has done is ultimately it's underexposed the overall picture and save the details in the highlights. Now this can be okay because we can recover a lot of the details in the shadows. However, if we don't get that spot perfectly on the bird, what it's going to do is this. So this time what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at if the spot metering was just looking in the shadowy areas. This right here is what the camera thinks is in front of it. It looks like a very, very dark picture from what the histogram can see in front of it. So what the camera is going to want to do is it's going to raise our exposure. Ultimately, if I'm using a setting like auto ISO, it's going to be raising my ISO, so I'm going to be coming away with a much noisier picture as well. But to balance our histogram, it's going to look something more like this, for example. Now our histogram now looks correct, but let's have a look at how the actual picture looks like now. And as you can see, it looks horrendous. It's massively gone to the right. We have this huge spike here. This shows me that there is lots of detail that are clipped, and if I press J, you can see all the areas where we've lost information. And this is going to be very, very hard to recover in post, and ultimately might lead to information that we've lost. Obviously, this is quite an extreme example, but it's interesting to know. Whereas if we compare that to using a wide metering mode, such as matrix or evaluative metering, then the histogram is going to be pretty consistently looking at an area, something like this. Even if we were to, miss by a little bit, as you can see, when I move around the frame, the histogram is barely moving at all. This means that we're going to get a pretty consistent exposure, regardless of how we've framed our composition. And this to me in wildlife photography is incredibly important, because unlike with landscapes where mountains do not move, or portrait photography where you've got a bit more control over what's going on in front of you, you have no idea what the wildlife is going to do. It's incredibly unpredictable, and you don't know whether this duck in front of you is going to carry on sitting on this log, or if it's going to go fly off into the sunset at any moment. This is why I think for 99% of wildlife photographers, you're going to get far more mileage out of just sticking in the matrix metering modes. Now, you still can be reactive to the lighting conditions in these matrix metering modes by using exposure compensation. For me, when I'm in high contrast situations, photographing animals where I want to retain the detail from their plumage, such as when I'm shooting on a very bright day, photographing puffins for example, I will try and underexpose my images by about 2/3 of a stop. This will allow me to retain the details in the plumage, and I can recover this detail in post far more easily than I can recover the details if I expose for the shadows and try to reclaim the highlights. Now, a really good tip that applies to all the metering modes is to make sure that when you're taking photos, to turn on your zebra lines. Now, what on earth are zebra lines? Well, essentially what this is it will show you areas of your photograph which are overexposed when you're taking your photo. And this is represented on most cameras by hashed lines, which is what gives it its name. And this is such a great indication when you see these hashed lines that you need to think about reducing your overall exposure using exposure compensation. If you've got any questions about this topic or anything else, drop them down in the comments section below. I'll either answer them down there or perhaps even make a video on it like this. I think at this point YouTube will be suggesting a video which will appear somewhere up here by TV Magic. Finally, thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.